How many brothers and sisters do you have? And when were they born?
Okay, I am going to actually refer to my written history to give some of this information, which might make it a little bit more flow a little easier. So there were 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. So I had the 4 brothers and 3 sisters. And we'll start out with our oldest in the family, Norman, Hiram, Norman, Mama. Norman and Ed, who was the second brother, would take Jean and I should say. And he just seemed to be a happy-go-lucky person. He worked really hard, but he went into the Marines about the time the Second World War started. So he was gone for 4 years in the military. And then when he came home, he married Lois Scranton in 1947, and Jean and I were 8 years old. So this tells you that we were probably 4 years old when he went into the Marines. He passed away in 1973 from lung cancer, and it was a rare kind of a cancer that just kind of filled up his lungs and cut off his oxygen. Pretty hard way to go. And none of the children, his children, there were, I believe, 8 children, were married at the time he passed away. So that was pretty hard on his wife and family. So the second brother was, we called him Ed, but Edward Reitman, and he was born in 1922. And when we lived in Dishman, which we've talked about a little bit, Jean and I were in kindergarten, he went into the Army, and he was actually discharged from the military about 6 months after that because of a knee problem. He had played football in high school and apparently had an injury which caused him problems when he went into the military. So they did give him a medical release from that. He didn't live at home much after he came back from the military. He was always hardworking and out working on farms and ranches in the Spokane area. He married Alva Mae Garfield, there it came. And she had already had 2 children. One was Bruce and one was Gracie Ann. And Ed was so good to those kids. She was divorced, and her family had a wheat farm down out of the Spokane area in what was called Ewan. And so he became part of that operation, and we would go visit them, or they would come visit us. And he was a fun guy, and I think when I got to be friends with him was after my mother lived with us, and he would come visit her. And we'll probably talk about that more a little bit later on. The second or third brother was Vern Reitman. He was born in 1924. I don't remember a whole lot about him because he joined the military, the Army, the same time Ed did. They had decided to go in together and wanted to be paratroopers. But with Ed having the problem he did, he was discharged, but Vern wasn't. So he did become a paratrooper and was wounded, and then in the Battle of the Bulge in Germany, died on February 5th, 1944 from those injuries in a German hospital, is what we were told. When we left Green Acres and moved to the Ixel Ranch, he and Ed did stay with us there part of the time so they could finish high school. the fourth son was Dean Reitman, so it looks like other than Norman, they gave all the other boys that middle name Wright, which is my mother's maiden name. He was born in 1926, and he was our dad's main helper on the ranches and dairies that we lived on. He and Irma, who was the oldest daughter, were about 18, 19 months apart. And so they were some of the main helpers because the rest of us were pretty small at that point. But Dean wasn't able to go into the military because he had flat feet, and I don't understand exactly why that prohibits you from being in the military, but it did. He actually married really young. He was 18 and married a gal who was, I think, 15 or 16. And I think they kind of fibbed and said they needed to get married, but ended up they really didn't. So, but he worked with my dad even after he was married for quite a while. And then they found a different place not too far away from where we lived at that time on the Sneva place. Oh, another thing apparently that prohibited him from going into the military because he was kind of goofing off one time and ran into, it's kind of a dish towel rack that you could pull out a sharp thing and then another sharp thing, and you could hang the dish towels on, and then it would fold in. But one of those was out, and it was sharp on the end because it was a piece of metal, actually. And he ran that into his one eye and actually was blind in that eye for the rest of his life. So that definitely was one of the reasons he couldn't go in. But he and his wife, Devota, lived in Spokane for many years. And I just remember that he liked to hunt, and so he would come up to the ranch that we lived on out of Colville and hunt bear and deer and different things. So we got to see these brothers fairly often after they got married. Then there was Irma. She was Irma Alberta Mon, and so my mother's name was Alice Alberta, and so she was named after her. She was born in 1928, and she always felt like she was our second mom because our mother did have asthma and a few other health problems, and so Irma did do a lot. She was 9 when we were born and took on a lot of responsibility. She always worked really hard, and after Frank Scranton, who was actually the brother to Norman's wife, Lois Scranton, after Frank got home from Germany, Irma and Frank got married. And the fun thing is that Irma and Frank and Norman and Lois had a double wedding. So brothers and sisters, brother and sister married brother and sister. Frank was really a good guy, and their family had lived around the IXL Ranch area out of Athol, Idaho, and so we had known them for quite a few years. As those kids were growing up, they knew each other. Okay, and then there's Lily Marie Mon. She's a sister who was 4 years older than Jean and I. She was born in 1934 in Montana. I failed to say where the others were born, but I think we talked about that a little bit earlier. And she had a temperament that was really hard to figure out. Not really sure, but you kind of tiptoed around her. So in talking about Lily, I'm going to just read a little bit of what I had written in my journal. Jean and I did think she was the pet because she always seemed to get away with a whole lot more than we did. And she also had a way of getting her sister's in trouble, and seemed to kind of enjoy that for some reason. But over the years, I've kind of decided that, she might have had some kind of a little disability. I know Mother and Dad really didn't quite know how to deal with her. So that's probably why she got away with things a little bit more. She seemed to be really afraid of a lot of things, and there were a few times she was left in charge of us for a little while if Mother and Dad went off somewhere. And sometimes she would just start screaming, "We're gonna die, we're gonna die. Somebody's gonna come get us," and she would scare Jean and I. And so we would run hide, so we would hopefully be safe. But Lily was just a really interesting sister. She wouldn't want to go upstairs to the bedrooms by herself. She'd always want somebody to go with her because she was afraid. And she didn't even like going into the bathroom by herself if it was after dark. So I'm going to kind of quote what Mother said. Right after Lily was born, Grandma Wright cleaned her up because Grandma was the one that delivered the baby, wrapped her in a blanket, put her in her basket, blew out the lamp, and left the room. And she said as soon as she left, Lily started to scream. And they'd go back in, take a light, go back in, and she would stop crying. So she apparently was afraid of the dark from the minute she was born. And I certainly don't understand how that happens. So Jean and I were born, as I had mentioned earlier, in St. Ignatius, Montana. She was 12 minutes older than me, and she likes to remind me that she's the oldest. And we kind of kid about that. I feel like I was really blessed that we were able to be born together. We're not exactly alike, but there are a lot of things that we do like doing the same thing. She's been a fun sister and kind of my protector and defender when I was growing up. I was kind of quiet and shy, and I feel like I just tried to stay out of the way of all the drama that might be going on that was created by Lily. But anyway, she was a good friend to me, and she has really a cute, fun personality. And just off the cuff, she can say something that you just laugh your head off about, and it comes natural. It isn't something she's planning to say. She is really very, very talented. She makes beautiful quilts and a lot of handiwork. This is her hobby. But she worked in a law firm. She worked for the church office building as a typist for interviews that were being taken from people all over the world by church historians. She plays the piano. We used to sing together. We sang for tons of things in high school. We sang for dances. We sang for different programs at the church, along with those groups that we were part of. Sang for church. We even sang for funerals for people who weren't members of the church. They'd have us come sing in their programs. Right now, we both have old, raspy voices, so we're no longer singers. So Jean married Del Leverett when she was a senior in high school. They ran away and got married. And I'm not going to really go into any more of that, but they did divorce in 1958 because of some problems they were having. They'd had one little girl who actually ended up dying. She had a collapsed lung, and they were trying to take care of this, but because of complications and things, she did pass away. So she dated Blaine Hyde, and I believe it was in 1958 or 59 that they got married. So that's my siblings.
So what were your grandparents like? Where were they born? And what do you remember about them?
Okay, I'll start with Grandma Mon. She passed away when Jean and I were only 1 year old, and this is my dad's mom. I don't remember what year she was born, but she died in March of 1939. She was, from what I heard, was just a really loving grandma, but had a hard life. She had really a hard life. She actually was in a car accident right after they started driving cars, because they drove horses and wagons and buggies and rode horses until, early on, about the time, I guess, just before Jean and I were born. But the car tipped over. She had her arm out the window and it cut off her one arm. So she worked hard her whole life with one arm, and she learned how to do that. So Grandpa Mon was my dad's dad, and I don't remember much about him other than I was kind of afraid of him. When we would go visit with him, you'd be kind of sitting in a chair and he'd just kind of look at you, and just kind of those cold little eyes. He wasn't one that you'd run and say, "Grandpa, Grandpa, it's so good to see you." You just kind of stood there and minded your P's and Q's so he wouldn't get upset with you. As an adult, I wonder what he really went through. He lost his wife pretty early on and lived alone. He did live close to some of his kids, but I have to think, I wonder what kind of a life he had, because he was hard. He was the one that would beat his kids with a rope, with a shovel, with whatever he had at hand. He was a hard man. So it makes me wonder what he actually went through as he was growing up. Now, Grandpa Wright, who was Mother's dad, died when we lived in Green Acres, so we were pretty young there, but I remember a little bit about him. We called him the tickling grandpa because he'd like to tickle you and make you laugh and chase you around a little bit. He had stomach problems, bleeding ulcers, so a lot of times he was sick and a lot of times he wasn't able to work. So my mother and her siblings growing up, they knew what being poor was too. So Grandma Wright lived until she was in her early 90s. So we got to know her way better. She would giggle with us, be silly with us. I remember when we'd go visit her, she lived in Charlotte, Montana, and there were some of her kids living close to her. But she would let us wear her dresses, clump around in her shoes, put all the jewelry she might have on. The little house that she lived in, I think Grandpa had built for her before he passed away. It had a little kitchen, a little living room, and a bedroom, and the bathroom was one of the outhouses outside. So it was a teeny tiny house. It had a white picket fence around it. She would have flowers growing around that fence. I thought it was just the cutest, funnest place to go. When she got a washer, it was a wringer washer, and it was set out, built kind of in a little lean-to on her back porch, because there was not room in that little house for her to have. Okay, and talking about Grandma Wright, I remember Mother telling us that Grandma had really a poor existence after she was married. They just did not have a lot of money. they were raising the family there in Beezer, Canada. And there were times when she only had one dress, and it had been patched over so many times that she was embarrassed to even go to the door and, you know, talk to people that might come, or even go to church. And Grandma loved beautiful clothes, and I remember after Grandpa had passed away quite a few years, and my parents were living in California, taking care of a boys' ranch there that my grandma came down, and Mother and Dad took her shopping and told her she could buy a couple of new dresses. She didn't want to, but they talked her into it and just said, "We want to do this for you." And she picked out a beautiful red dress, and then she just cried and just says, "I've always loved beautiful clothes." And so that made me happy that they had done that for her. She did live next door to some of her sons, so she was well taken care of, and we loved going to her house.
Did you have any pets?
I always had a dog, and normally they were a combination of a collie shepherd, because those could be used as cattle dogs that could be trained to, you know, help out with the cattle. And basically, helping out with the cattle for us meant helping bring the milk cows in from the field into the barn. If the cows started toward the barn, the dog would just get behind and follow them and kind of keep them going. But I loved dogs, and I had a couple that I just really loved. Normally, their name was Shep, and I think that's because of the famous dog called Shep that I think was in a movie. But I would sit and just talk with that dog just like it was a person, and I felt like he really understood me. He'd look up and kind of look into my eyes and have this sad little look on his face if I was sad. But it was just really fun, and everywhere I went, he would follow me. If I was going up to take care of the chickens or on another errand, he would always follow me. If I was eating a green apple, I'd hand him the apple core and he would chew it up. So he was kind of one of my best friends. I really enjoyed that particular dog. And I guess I can tell you really something sad. Because he liked to follow me, we'd come in from the hayfield for lunch, and that was normally our big meal. And as we were leaving, we were in a big truck. Sometimes it was those wagons that we hauled the hay on, but we were in a big truck, and he jumped up on the running board trying to go with us, and he fell off and the truck ran over him, and he did die. So that was really sad for me. I cried and cried and cried. But yes, I did love dogs.
What were you like as a child?
I would say I was very quiet with the other siblings, and sometimes with some of the drama that went on, mostly involving Lily and Jean, but sometimes even Irma. I just felt like I wanted to stay out of the way. I did not want to be part of that. So I'll probably insert here that period of time, a lot of parents thought their children were to be seen and not heard. So we were not really allowed to express a lot how we felt, what we thought about a certain situation. So I think I was just kind of shy and kind of hung back.
What did you like to eat?
Well, our food was basic food, you know, meat, potatoes, gravy, vegetables, and then we grew strawberries. And we would go to different orchards out of our area to buy peaches because the peach trees would not grow there. It was too cold. So it was just basic food. I like to make cookies. I made cookies a lot. Jean did a lot of cooking and she made cakes and pies. She was a good cook. But just pretty basic food.
What did you do for fun? Did you have any favorite toys or games?
Well, I like to play with paper dolls. That was something I really liked doing, and when we could buy a set of paper dolls, then we would trace over the clothes and design new clothes and make new clothes for them. So that was part of the fun too. We played games like Authors, Monopoly, and just some of those games that have been around for a long time. But we like to play outside, go for hikes, and we would go into the trees and make little trails around through the trees and say, this is your room and that's your room and this is the living room and this. So we just made up our fun. And another thing we like to do is the creek that ran below the house on the other side of the barn. On the opposite side of the creek, there was a big bank that went up. We would get up on that bank and sing and pretend we were opera stars and kind of dance around like we were putting on some kind of show. But we basically had to learn how to entertain ourselves. We had the radio. We could listen to the radio, usually in the evenings. And some of the programs we listened to were The Lone Ranger, one that was called The Whistler, which was kind of a suspense type thing. Trying to think, just those kinds of things that we could listen to. And normally when we were listening to those, we were sitting and embroidering on dish towels or pillowcases. But that was fun.
Did you get an allowance?
We did not. As I had mentioned earlier on, there just was no money. There was no money. So, no allowance.
What responsibilities did you have at home when you were young? You kind of touched on this.
Yeah, I have touched on this some. It was just the basic chores around the place. Of course, we had work in the house. We had to help do the housework, do dishes, help with the laundry. And that one year I mentioned where we did not have electricity, for the first little while, we would actually wash clothes Mother would put a great big, what they called a big boiler, but it was a big pan, heated up with water, and we'd put the clothes in there and use a scrub board, like you see in the olden days. And then we were able to get a gas wringer washer. And so that was a different way to wash clothes than people do today.
What kind of schools did you go to? And what was your favorite subject? And your least favorite?
And my least favorite, well, I can say my least favorite was math. I just did not like math. I liked history. I didn't mind English, literature, but math was really the one that I struggled with. But I did pretty well in school because I studied hard, not because I was really smart, but I really studied hard to get good grades. So our schools were a combination of regular schools, you know, if we lived close to towns or in towns, like when we were in Dishman. But when living out in the country, we would go to a one-room schoolhouse, and the teacher would teach first grade up through 6th or 7th grade. And then at the end of that time, we were bused in to the town to go to junior high and high school. But we really liked that grade school. In fact, I was just looking here. So the one school that I'm going to kind of refer to was the Mill Creek School, which was halfway between the ranch we lived on and Colville, which was a town. And it was one of the one-room schoolhouses. It was in the woods, so we could play up in the trees behind the school during recesses. And then in the wintertime, we could sleigh ride down those hills behind the school. And we did participate in track because all of these different schools, similar to ours, would have track meets. And Gina and I were pretty good at running, even doing some of the high jumping, and they even had like your spelling bees and those types of things that we participated in. So that was fun.
Did you have any heroes or role models when you were a child?
Yes, Lone Ranger. And when we were able to go to movies, and again, this was usually on a night that my dad had to go in for a meeting. We could go into the theater and go to a movie, and we liked Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. And they both sang. They were singing Cowboys and Cowgirl. We liked musicals, movies with musicals. And another thing I think I'll bring up right here is we loved to read. We read a lot. We would check out library books, could bring them home from school, and would read a lot. And Mother would even sometimes read us some stories that she had grown up on, like The Girl of the Limberlost, I'm trying to think, Freckles, and they were all kind of the same time period. But reading was something we loved to do.
How did your family celebrate holidays? Did you go on vacation, and did you get a lot of relatives together during holidays?
Yes, we did. It would depend on probably the year because, and on the amount of gas we had. So one of the fun things we would do every year, so we lived out of the Spokane, north of Spokane area, and a lot of our relatives still lived over out of the Ronan, Montana area. So there was always a yearly reunion, and we would always, that was something we would plan to go to. And the fun thing about this is that my mother and dad, their siblings intermarried into each of their families. So some of Mother's brothers married some of Dad's sisters, some of Dad's brothers married Mother's sisters. So it was, a really intermarried family, I guess. So, and a couple of times there we would say we were double cousins because my dad and his brother married, my mom and one of her sisters. Anyway, we just had a blast when we'd go over there. We would just hang out with a billion cousins, it seems like. We'd hike, we'd play baseball, did some horseback riding. They always had a dance, and there was never a shortage of people to dance with because of all those cousins. Because one aunt had 13 kids, another had 10, Mother and Dad had 8, and then just on and on with the extended family that would come. So it was just a blast. That was probably the big highlight. On holidays, my married siblings would come home and we'd have a big dinner. Once in a while, we would travel to their places. So that was kind of fun because with the gas being expensive and no money to speak of, you had to kind of plan where you could go, when you could go, and that type of thing. But family was just a really big thing. We got together with family.
What was the best gift you remember receiving as a child?
Probably a doll. And this doll, I would say, was probably 14, 15 inches long, pretty big. Because normally for Christmas, we would get our new pajamas, our new socks, our new underthings, just whatever we needed, we would get. So when these dolls came, we were ecstatic because that was so unusual. And I'm just going to also insert here that for birthdays, Mother would probably make a cake for us, but there was no big deal about the birthday.
What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, this is kind of funny because I loved living in the country. I think I always thought I would probably marry a farmer and just live on a farm. But I always thought I would want to be a forest ranger and live up in one of the fire towers. And so some of the fire towers, you would live at the top. They'd have a room up there would have kind of a cot, probably a little bowl for water. There would be no water pipe clear up there. So it'd be pretty rustic. And then other of the fire towers would have a little cabin built down at the foot of them that you'd live in, and then you'd have to go up and down. And these were built in the area to watch for fires. This was very mountainous, lots of trees, and probably mostly lightning strikes. But you would have to learn how to run the equipment, and probably, I assume, some kind of a two-way radio. I'm not really sure all of the equipment they had back then. But I always thought that's what I wanted to be, I wanted to be a forest ranger and work in one of those.
What inventions do you remember most?
Okay, I'm going to talk about farm equipment right now because when I was smaller, when we would put up hay, I would watch some of my older siblings, and the hay would be mowed and then raked into rows, and this would have been done with a team of horses pulling a mower or a rake. And then you would pull the wagon alongside those rows and pitchfork it onto the wagon. Gene and I would tromp the hay so that they could get more on the truck or on the wagon. So when we were able to get a baler and a tractor, that was really a big deal. And all of these things had been invented before, we just weren't able to afford having them. And the same with the electric stove for the kitchen. We had used wood-burning stoves to cook on, and our heat was always a wood-burning stove. We didn't have a furnace like we're used to nowadays. So those, probably can't say inventions, but those were things that was fun to evolve into in our lives.
When you were a teenager, what did you do for fun?
Well, we're kind of right back to, we had to entertain ourselves for the most part. But as a teenager, we were able to go to some of the school dances, and Gina and I were involved in singing a lot with our groups and with ourselves. So probably, I would say going to the dances were the most fun. And some of them were just the casual dances, and once in a while, they were the formal dances. And with Mother driving the school bus, having that little bit of extra money come in, she would always put some of that away, and we would be able to get a kind of a formal type dress or gown or whatever to wear to those dances. Movies, going to a movie was always exciting for us.
As a teenager, did you ever get into any trouble?
Not really often, because I really wanted to try to obey the rules, so to speak. But we did have a curfew when we were dating that we had to be in by midnight, because it was 25 miles from town. So by the time you get through with a movie or a dance, you know, there had to be a little bit of latitude there that we'd have time to get home. But I remember one time, Jean and I were on a double date, which we did quite a bit. And on our way home, a car was broken down just outside of town, not very far. And it was some of our friends. And so we stopped to help them and get them taken care of. And so we got home just a little bit, maybe 20 minutes after our curfew. And Dad was right there, and he just said, might as well put on your work clothes and go out and do your chores. It's almost morning. And then he kind of looked at us and said, go ahead and go to bed, and we'll talk about it in the morning. Because I think we basically had said, you know, a car was broken down and we were helping them. But anyways, that's probably the only time I can think of where I got in trouble, when I was a teenager, for that type of thing.
When did you learn how to drive?
So there wasn't the type of driver's ed classes back then. Jean and I had driven the truck out in the hayfield quite a bit, and once in a while Mother would let us drive on our way into town if we were going into town for something during the day. But I didn't do that much driving. And so after I got engaged and knew I was going to get married, one thing Glen told me is, you'll need your driver's license if you don't have that. And so I got my driver's license probably a few weeks before I got married. Because as far as getting in the car and going into town, it never happened. We were either with Mother or Dad, and maybe one of them would let us drive.
What was your graduation from high school like, and what goals and dreams did you have for your life afterwards?
So graduation was probably basically the way things happen nowadays. But there were 99 of us in our class that graduated, and we just had the regular type ceremony, and then there was a dinner and a dance held, and I was able to go to that. By this time, Jean had gotten married and wasn't home. She graduated from a different high school than I did, but I just hung out with friends. So in talking about graduation, I'm gonna maybe explain a little bit about my life up to this point. I had dated a young man in high school. We started liking each other in junior high, and then in high school we dated. And really, I've kind of planned on getting married, but I was wanting to marry somebody in the temple. I had gotten my patriarchal blessing at a really young age, and it basically said that if I were faithful, I would be able to marry in the temple. And so the older I got and the more we were dating, I kind of got wondering if that was going to happen, because I had talked to him about the church. He wasn't that interested. He was a really good kid. He was a football captain. He was in all of the clubs, a hard worker. He didn't smoke. His parents did. But he finally said, I'd taken him to I even took him to a state conference, took him to church. He just finally said he felt like he needed church in his life. So I thought about that and I prayed about that. I really prayed hard about that. And I knew I had to break it off because I did want to have church in my life. And so we did break up. And probably, 6 months, I'll just say 6 months, a young man moved into our branch. His parents lived there, and so he had been working in Nevada. He moved into the branch. He was kind of a wild hair, I think. But I kept thinking, well, maybe I could help him a little bit, because he was showing some interest, and he asked me out, and we went out on a few dates, and I knew I wasn't madly in love with him for sure, but he asked me to marry him after a while. And I said, I don't love you. And he basically said, but you will, you'll learn to love me. And so stupid me. And I'm saying stupid, it was really stupid, immature. I said, oh, okay. Because I think I was still kind of in the throes of breaking up with this other person I really did care for. And we were engaged most of my senior year. And probably a few weeks before my graduation, I broke up with him. Finally, I had tried 2 or 3 times, and he basically said, I'll kill myself. You do. I finally found out that he was seeing other girls, and I just confronted him with it and said, you know what? I'm done. If you're doing this now, it's certainly not going to get better after we're married. Anyway, we broke up. So for that dance I mentioned, going to for my graduation, one of my really good friends in high school, she had gotten married before graduation, but she and her husband took me to the dance, and then they decided they wanted to leave a little bit early, which I said that's fine, because they actually lived past where I lived, so it was a long ways for just somebody to take me home. But this young man that I had been dating, he was dating another girl, but he said, we'll take you home if you want to stay longer. And I found out, and so they did, but I found out after the next day or two that this kid that I had broken my engagement with had come up and was trying to get in and caused a big ruckus there at the dance, and the other boys wouldn't let him in. They said, you're not going to get near her again. They just were good kids. You know, they weren't LDS, but they were just good kids, and they really respected what Gina and I stood for and what we believed.